Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the occasional series of MEF Fireside chats. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to this webinar Julian Ranger from DigiMe, who will be known to some of you in the Personal Data and Identity Working Group. Today, Julian and I are going to be discussing the response to the current COVID-19 crisis and really what the industry can do to assist and sort of muck in to try and manage the outbreak as far as possible. There's been obviously some really interesting developments in recent days on that. So without further ado, I'll introduce Julian, just for anyone who, and I can't imagine that there will be many of them, Julian, but just in case there's anyone out there who doesn't know who you are.
Hi everyone, I'm Julian Ranger. I'm the executive chairman and founder of a company called Digi.me.
And Julian sits on the board of MEF also, so we work quite closely. So just to kick things off, in a sort of wider context, Julian, what's your view of the current industry responses to the crisis? What do you think is happening, rather than from a DigiMe perspective, but from a more global perspective? What do you think is happening today? Because we're seeing some very interesting stuff. What's your view? Can you give it some context and what you feel is good and perhaps not so good about the industry response you've seen already?
Well, a lot of it really comes around to us as individuals. We're locked down at home, many of us, although you've got essential workers traveling. So clearly we've seen a rise in all sorts of technology on the work side, you know, the rise of Zoom, etc., and all the video conferencing and learning to do more things remotely. And we see that in our business. Now, we're a technology business. Writing software has always been a bit of multi-site and whatever, but you have to get better at organization. So there's a lot of that been happening. But at home, we've been doing some things. Obviously, you know, more and more people using their mobiles for at-home shopping and deliveries, for organizing and managing things, communication, children's remote learning. My daughter is now sort of, you know, a bit of a Teams whiz with her school, even though she's A-levels. We're doing telehealth, more video calls on health and things like that. So actually, if you just look at us as individuals, whether we're workers or whether we're at home, there's been a tremendous response. Now, a lot of it has been doing more of what has been there, but maybe hasn't been as deeply embedded. So when we come out of this, from both a work perspective and a home perspective, we've taken a leap. We've probably compressed 2-3 years worth of stuff into, you know, a few months across the piece. Now, then, of course, there's the wider things with all the, you know, PPE and all the other technology stuff about managing the crisis. But from my perspective of people sitting at home and then how do we move to the next phase of exiting lockdown in a managed way, it's been interesting to see that rapid adoption of stuff that was adopted, used, but now is used much more widely and is part of the lexicon.
I think, I suppose the really obvious example there is probably Zoom. You know, the amount of people who, for whom joining an online meeting and putting their video on was probably anathema up until, you know, 6 weeks ago. I've always done, you know, these sort of meetings as long as they've been available, but it's been pretty few and far between, principally because people find it difficult. And you know yourself, when you're doing conference calls over the phone, sometimes that can be very difficult, especially when you're getting responses from a multitude of people. So I think what's been really encouraging is the way people have embraced the technology, explored the limitations of it, you know, and tried to find ways around it, you know, things like raising hand if you want to speak, muting everybody, and the sort of etiquette of how that works. I think you're right, that a learning curve around that, because people are being forced to use it, has been exponential. So I think that's an interesting development. But I suppose for this, it's a question of how we move into the future. You're right. You know, we in the industry, we've always liked to travel. We've liked to go out and meet people. That's, you know, that's how business gets done. But the likely restrictions, probably sensible restrictions, most of them that we're likely to face in the future, mean that we have to think differently about how we do business and how we interact with other people. And obviously the government's introduction of the COVID-19 contact tracer app, you know, that type of idea is an interesting move forward, because the government is charged with regenerating economic activity. You know, say they're charged with it. I think we're all charged with it, aren't we? But what do you think of that in terms of a development? Do you think that approach has been applied to the COVID-19 problem, or do you think it goes beyond that in terms of what you've seen so far?
Well, I think there's an over focus on the track and trace piece. So I'm very interested in all of this from the aspect of personal data, which, you know, is part of the working group that we're looking at. And really what we have to understand is that there are multiple data exchange requirements between the individual and the government in this crisis. And the track and trace app is only looking at one aspect of that, right? And then we've not really fully understood before COVID that many of the things we were looking at in personal data between individuals and businesses also applies between individuals and governments, right? There was a little bit of understanding, particularly in health, which is obviously directly COVID. There was an understanding that if the individual finally was given access and held all of their health data, that you could move to a thing called patient centricity, where we took more, not just more care of ourselves, but more involved in our care, because we are the only ones that can pull all of our medical records together in one place and use it, check they're valid, have them wherever we go. But you know, the idea is we move to personalized medicine, where we've got apps running on our personal data, and that can only work if the data is accessible on my phone. I have my data. If we want to do research right down to the detail so that we can help precision medicine, then I'm going to have to share, you know, a lot more than is available if researchers go to the classic places like GPs or whatever, right? Yeah. So this was known, but wasn't really known was the fact that there was lots of other data we should be sharing with the government, right? So just to give you a use case that came out from Australia, and how would you solve this particular use case is an interesting one, was as soon as they went into lockdown, the supermarkets went to the government and said, hey, our home deliveries are all full. Would you like us to prioritize it for those with a social need? And the government said, yes, because you would, wouldn't you? You want the home deliveries for those that really need it. So the government has then spent 6 weeks going, so we know who needs a social need. How do we tell you and allow you to coordinate that with the people who are going to say they need it, but without breaching privacy concerns? And no answer. And then we said, well, you do realize that there's this technology around where the individual can hold the data themselves, sort of the my data, me to be, whatever you want to call it. And you know, my company is one of those that does that. But generically, it's about the individual having a tool to have his data and then to share it when they want. And they said, hold on a moment. So the government, we could have given that indication back to the individual in a way in which the individual can't modify it, which these tools do. And then the supermarkets could have just, if could I have priority support, they'd have asked for my social status. I say yes. Could have been done. They said, could we have done that in 3 or 4 days then? Yes. And there was this sort of light bulb moment of nobody had really thought how critically important it was for data to flow from the government to the individual, from the individual to a business, or from a business to the individual to the government, or the government to the individual back to the government. And COVID has highlighted this through many things. So when you look at the track and trace app, that's only looking at one thing. Now, in the UK, where we are, and it's just been launched in the Isle of Wight today, they're actually doing 2 things, which is perhaps I would say, not that sensible, but let's not criticize the government for trying to do something, because doing something is at least moving it forward, right? But they're trying to have people understand when they've come within contact, and then perhaps be alerted if you, like we were having this as a proper fireside chat, you get COVID in 4 days' time, my phone would say, ping, you've been near someone who's got COVID. They wouldn't have said Ian, they'd have just said, on this day, so 3 days ago. So I'd then think about it and maybe go for testing. That's one purpose. Now, what they're doing, however, is they're taking that data centrally, because they want to then get a little bit of situational awareness as to what's happening in the country. Now, the problem there is it's not really designed for that. So it's a bit, and what they've done is they're damaging their privacy piece on the phone. Now, I'm not saying it's not private. I think if the government does everything that they say they do, and if you believe them, then it will be private. But you must never forget with technology, and I think us as business people realize it's not just whether technology works, it's just not whether it is something private or it is secure, but there's a psychological perceptive issue about individuals.
Absolutely.
And I think, unfortunately, track and trace is an example where governments have gone, wow, the technology can do something maybe better than we can do manually, but they've forgotten the psychology. And in that moment, they've made their big mistake that they've done, because they've taken us psychologically to a place that we're not yet ready for. So where psychologically we were talking about Zoom, yeah, we're pretty much ready for that. We do phone calling. Zoom with 4 or 5 people is an extension of the video calling you might have done.
Mm-hmm.
Psychologically, it wasn't a big move. But psychologically, to go from your phone being yours to it now transmitting something, which I know is only a Bluetooth code and encrypted. You know that, I know that. People listening to this Fireside chat know that. But the public doesn't know that.
Mm.
Now, so what the interesting thing we're trying to sort of indicate to governments and everything else is, actually, you should have split down the, in good old-fashioned tech speak, the information exchange requirements into pieces, and then worked out how you bring that all together in a citizen-centric way, because we're doing something at scale we've never done before. And we know from all the problems we've got in the industry that trust, user control, privacy, security, consent are critical to the mass flow of data. And we've not really reached there yet, but some governments have. So we're working with a number of governments. I would say it's early days. No one has sort of fully leapt off the pier yet and swimming into this new world of citizen centricity, but they're very close. They're putting on their swimming trunks, if you like, at the moment, testing the temperature of the water. Probably a terrible analogy. Apologies for anybody. But
it's a great analogy. Okay.
But that's what we need to do. And the interesting thing is, I ask people, so what do we mean by citizen centricity? We mean I have my data. So if you want to ask me for it, you have to ask me with a certificate. And if I say yes, then my data flows. But I've decided to do it in the full knowledge of what I'm doing. And so if you think of situational awareness, probably the most important thing any business, any government, any military campaign needs, what's happening before you make a decision, right? So we want to exit lockdown. How many people are currently feeling ill in the country? Nobody knows. How many people are feeling well? Nobody knows. How many people have been tested positive for COVID? That we know. But we don't know all their postcodes necessarily. How many people feel they've had COVID but haven't told anybody? Nobody knows. Well, how can we find out? Well, there actually are some apps which are asking you to enter your symptoms every day.
Mm.
But where's that data going? Well, it's going to one researcher over here or one researcher over there.
Sure.
Imagine if I could enter that data myself into my own system, and the government could ask me for that data, and every day, anonymously, they got that data. Wow, we suddenly know exactly where the hotspots are. We know what's happening. And if you do that for a week before you come out of lockdown, then you come out of lockdown. What you don't want is to find out a week later that something's gone wrong in an area. You need to find out in 2, 3, 4 days as it's happening. But of course, if I'm self-reporting my symptoms, you can see that change happening in the daily flow. That's a huge piece of data. But even better, That data, which I'm volunteering deliberately, I know I am, I've said yes, and it's not very psychologically difficult to volunteer anonymously. Do I feel well? Have I got a cold? And an age range and a few minor things like that. That allows the government to work out some levels of comorbidities and other stuff and indicate people who go through not feeling well, you may have COVID, go and get a test. And through the same anonymous channel, you can poke back an answer. They don't know who they poked it back to, but they can say, you should go and get a test. These are things that psychologically we're ready for. When you then get a test and you're positive for COVID, yes, you can have the track and trace app, right? And the way Australia's done it is that you manual tracer like you or opposite me, and you say, Julian, are you using the track and trace app? I say, yes. He said, would you mind entering this code into your app to release to you, Ian, the telephone numbers of other people who you need to contact, right? And I say yes, and then you've done it. So I've said consented, but you then ring them. But that's a bit late because they've been going through, right? Wow. And also, you also want to know where I've been, but I can't remember where I've been. But if I have my position data on my phone, or I've been checking in and out on my phone with QR codes, I can tell you verbally. These are all things. When I go for testing, if they want to know some of my symptoms to help them understand, they can do it. If I get my test results back and all in the same piece of one area of all of my data, we can then use it possibly for immunity certificates, although there are some pluses and minuses to that and everything else. But what we're trying to point out here is that this is a point in time when there's lots of information flows from the individual. And we need to enable the individual with things we've been talking about, my data type solutions for a long time. We need to recognize that the time has come for citizen centricity when we really do own, control, manage that privacy security. And the government will have better data. So what we've got is that the governments have taken a half leap, but they've kind of done it a little bit centralized, a little bit old school. No, trust us, it's centralized, but we know what we're doing. They didn't take the full leap to decentralization and say, actually, we would get better data. And that's the interesting thing, that we've not yet made that full leap there, yet they could have done so. And I think they will do so, to be honest.
And obviously the problem with that approach is that there are the people out there, for, whether you agree with their reasoning or not, who have a distrust of governments, of institutions, and in terms of, the sharing of personal data. A lot of this is obviously fueled by misinformation and also, I think, not understanding. I use the DigiMe app. I understand the thinking behind it and the protections behind it. But there is this public perception that because, of cases that people have read about in the media where, data was shared either on purpose or inadvertently, it doesn't really matter. So there is this issue of distrust that needs to be overcome. And obviously the DigiMe approach towards a more citizen-centric approach obviously goes some way to addressing that. But that has to have some sort of governmental, is it the government backing you or the other way around? I suppose it's the other way around, isn't it?
Well, it's actually the sort of the privacy organisation. So in one European country that we're looking to work in, for example, the premier privacy organisation is saying that this is exactly the way to go, and that's to give citizen things. But it's also how you message it, right? I mean, if the citizen really does own all the data, if no data can really leave their device without them saying yes, you start from a position of trust, control, privacy, security. Whereas when you're trying to do track and trace, you're starting from a position of your app's doing something and don't worry, you don't really understand it. Because it is difficult to understand. I mean, I talk to technologists and I've had to bury myself in this, and I understand how it all works. But it took me, I'm going to say a good 2 days of technical discussions and deep dives and everything else to be able to talk about it easily. Well, your average citizen is just going to say, no, it's broadcasting my location. No, it isn't broadcasting your location. But how can you prove that? How can you explain that in easy things? So when you move to a position where the battle is the explanation and then the false news can place, you're in a hard place before you start, right? And so your percentages will drop. right? Where you need to be is in a position where trust, privacy is absolutely 100%. And yes, you may then have to persuade the skeptics, but at least the vast majority, not the vast majority, hopefully a majority, but a good number anyway, will say yes. And then you can persuade others to say yes on top, because they can see that there's value, that the government's getting value. It's instantaneous value as well, self-assessments, situational awareness. And then you can start to add other things. And when the government's also giving you back data, like your health data, so that you can use that for telemedicine, because you have to do that. Otherwise, you're trying to remember stuff and you don't know what it is. As I said, the information exchanges have now multiplied tremendously between government and citizens, not just one way. Then you start from a position of trust. Everything then works. Now, you're never going to get 100%. You're probably not going to get 90 or even 80%. But, you know, track and trace needs 60% to work. That's a high bar when it's psychologically difficult. And I'm not sure, well, no nation to date has done it. And I think Australia did very, very well recently. They released it. They need 10 million as their 60% bar, I think, or something like that. So first 2 days, 2 million. 9 days later, 4.5 million.
Wow. That's pretty impressive.
So it's very impressive. I mean, 4.5 million, but it's been a full-on thing from the Prime Minister to everything. But they're not. Will they hit the 10 million bar? I want them to, right? I just think it's hard.
It seems a slightly inappropriate thing to focus on, but you know, it must be said that the current situation is driving, you know, some positives, and some of the positives are, you know, potentially around the acceleration of a greater understanding, you know, because everyone, you know, gets the EU GDPR-led debate around privacy, you know, and why it's important. But for most people, you know, and we've had these discussions for many years. For most people, the idea that they have to take an active interest in what data is shared with whom, and that they are actually able to exert some control over it, most people will not be aware of that. You know, they and this is where products like, you know, Digimes and the current, I suppose, the imperative delivered to us by COVID-19 is that is being pushed up the agenda, and that can only be a positive thing.
Without a doubt. I mean, we've talked long and hard in the working group at MEF on identity and privacy, personal data and privacy, about changing moments, right? And we've seen the privacy study that's now been going 5 years, or is it 6 years? I can't remember which.
I've got it here, six year.
And I've watched that all the way through, and it, you know, people be more and more concerned, but it's gradual, right? You know, we had the movement from the concerned to the slightly active customer and so on and so forth. This is a huge change. Yeah. And it's a change across the piece, because you had governments, like Netherlands is a really good example. The Netherlands were taking a lead in Europe for returning health data to the individual. In fact, paying companies like mine €7.50 per person downloading their data, just because they wanted the individuals to have the data, because they knew what that would then enable, and then the next step, program called MedMay. COVID, because of all the things I've said, is accelerating that understanding. Now, whether or not it'll be implemented in time is a whole different issue. You know, you've got priorities and everything else. But this has been the big kick forward. Next year's trust study will show a huge change in understanding, because we're having to do more things from home.
Interesting. We're perhaps going to have to ask different questions in the trust study. Not instead of, but in addition to, because of the way that the debate has changed, has moved. It's such a massive shift for everybody.
Yes. No, when I was looking at what we would be doing at the beginning of this year to what we're doing now at the end of April, but just at the beginning of May, it is chalk and cheese. Yeah. Right? Yes, we're still working with big companies. Yes, we're still working with startups, but we're talking national size rollouts now. We're talking not, you know, moving forwards with tens, then hundreds of thousands, then millions next year. We're talking about millions in weeks and months. And that's an adoption curve that nobody was thinking about in the My Data type B2B. Yeah, sure. world of personal data. And of course, it's doing exactly the same for personal identity. You know, we should look at the great moves forward. So, you know, my brain's just Yoti, a company doing identity, who've taken a massive leap forward, solving a problem for the NHS with people coming back and giving them electronic ID cards so that they can move around just overnight. Overnight, changing the way we holding, you know, those customers, those NHS workers are now holding their own digital identities. Well, can you imagine how long it would have taken for the NHS to do a worker digital identity scheme held on their phones in normal times? I mean, I suppose we might have been talking about the requirements in 2 years' time and maybe implementing in a year or two after that.
Can you imagine the decision-making process for that? I'd rather not.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Yet it was done in a month.
Yeah.
So that's a huge step forward. And that's, you know, it's not yet 1 million people, I think. It's only certain subsector of it. But it's still nonetheless a huge leap forward in very little time. And the same with a lot of other things, right? There's the data flows that are happening because of COVID are moving everything forward. So it's very interesting. I was talking with quite a good economist the other day about the recession and everything else. And he's usually, I've known him for actually 18 years, and he's always been slightly on the negative side. So if you follow his advice, you're always going to be slightly more conservative, so you feel okay. But anyway, he's quite adamant it's going to be a V-shaped recession, right? So, you know, his comment to businesses working with the consumer is be ready for the surge as we come out of lockdown, right? Which I think is quite interesting. You don't have to agree with that. But what it made me think about was be ready for the surge in the personal data and in the identity world and everything else happening. Because we've spent a lot of time trying to build it, trying to get understanding and everything else. And now there is that understanding in government, in industry, and I really do mean in industry, big companies we're talking with as well. And that surge may not happen the month, not quite like a consumer thing, you know, when we all suddenly run down the pub and go, yay, we can have a drink. But that surge is going to happen in 3 to 6 months. And it's going to be interesting because we're not used to it. We haven't planned for it.
Well, I think you're right. And I think the sort of, you know, V-shaped forecasting for the economy is a reasonable idea. I think what would be a great shame is if we don't learn the lessons from this. If we go back to exactly how things were, then obviously we'll have missed a huge opportunity. And, you know, not least of which, you know, around personal data, identity, authentication, that whole digital citizen sort of perspective that you and I are, you know, quite familiar with, but the vast majority of people aren't. So I think there's a lot of positives, obviously, that can come out of this, you know, during what is for many people, you know, we're the fortunate ones. You and I can sit here having a very civilized conversation, and, you know, but for people on the front line who are out working, either because they have to financially or because their role sort of compels them to, it behooves possibly the rest of us to try and do the best job possible for them to try and ensure that you know, as few people are affected by this in a devastating way as possible. Sorry.
Yeah, just thinking about that future resilience, and it's a good way to sort of perhaps sort of bring to an end, but is thinking about that. Just imagine, right? And this is actually quite a good sort of lesson to think about. Imagine we'd started COVID with everybody having all of their medical data themselves. Everybody having a tool set which any system could ask you for data within a day or two to create an app or service or whatever else. That you've got your wearables, you've got your bank data. So imagine that you've got that system in place. What would that have meant on day one? But it would have meant that the government could have, within a day or 2 days, said, could people please share with us how you're feeling? Could you share with us anonymously, right? And a large number of people do, your medications and your potential comorbidities like weight, like whether you've got cancer and some things, okay? Now, maybe 30, but maybe 60% of the population would have done that in the first week. No we don't know what's going on. No, we don't know who's doing it. We would have instant situational awareness, the ability to proactively plan and manage. We would have had a much better handle on it right up front. We may still have had to do lockdown. I mean, infectious diseases travel and they are infectious, right? But would have been shorter, sharper, would have known, right? And all because one thing would have changed. The citizen would have had their data.
Well, I suppose there's a parallel there. The government have been saying, you know, that their actions are being driven by science. It would, if it was driven additionally by data, then obviously that's a much more powerful statement.
It drives the science, and that's what they were short of, and that's what they're still short of. And that's really our plea to all governments, right? Is if you haven't worked it out already, you need a citizen-centric answer so that you can ask the citizen for data and you can give the citizen data to work with when they're locked down, like with the supermarket company or the electric company, or to get loans, or to do all the things that they need to do when they can't do it in the normal flow of things, right? So, yeah, this is going to happen because, you know, as sure as eggs are eggs, when you've got the aftermath, everyone's going to look at the future resilience and say, well, we need to have that. But I think actually it will happen slightly before that, but quite when in the next 3 to 6 months, I don't know. Could be very soon, it could be 3 to 6 months. But there is a big change. And I think it was 4 weeks ago, thereabouts, the last personal data and identity MEF meeting. And we sort of said, yeah, maybe some early thoughts on COVID. 4 weeks is a long time in personal data and identity in a COVID environment.
It certainly is. We're living in accelerated times. There's no doubt about that. Julian, where can people find out more about the DigiMe government citizen data sharing system?
So if you go to our website at digi.me, digi.me, you'll see there's a banner at the top and there's a video and some other stuff. And you can always contact me at Julian, Julian, at digi.me. Anytime, very happy just to talk about it generally. If people are interested, just as concerned citizens, want to know more, thinking about it, and also the whole wider personal data world. The other thing I would say is also go to mydata.org, which is mydata.org, which is the global MyData, and you'll see there that they talk a lot about many different things around COVID-19 and other aspects of citizen centricity.
Interestingly, I have the page open, and obviously you do a lot of work with these people. Could you just give us a quick overview of MyData and what it is they do, Julian?
Yeah, they're really good, actually. It came out of lots of years of discussions amongst people interested in personal data. And it's been stimulated, actually, fun enough, by the EU bringing everybody together, and everyone saying we should do this more often. So they're not a pressure group or anything else. They're a bit like the MEF. They're a not-for-profit, but with the mission of showing how my data can solve the world's data problems while sorting out privacy, security, and consent, but enabling greater use of personal data, right? And that's a key point. They're based... So it's a global organization. It's got hubs all around the world now. Very cheap for people to join. In fact, individuals can join for nothing. Businesses, if you're at all interested in personal data or self-sovereign identity or personal identity, go have a look at mydata.org. Great organization. Work hand in hand with the type of things we do here at MEF. But they're absolutely the right place to think about and see what people are talking about. Fantastic.
And for everybody watching, if you're a member of MEF or not a member of MEF, the Personal Data and Identity Group, working group cover obviously personal data and identity are things that we're majoring on currently. I suppose the COVID-19 situation has brought a lot of our stuff into sharp relief. If this is an area of interest for you, if you're watching this, I imagine it is, and please feel free to reach out to me, Iain at mobile, so it's Iain, IAIN, at mobileecosystemforum.com. I imagine there'll be a small blog which will give some details around this on our website. As Julian said, if you just wish to talk or discuss any aspect of what we talked about today, please feel free to reach out. You'd be very welcome. Julian, unless you've got anything else, I think it just behooves me to wish you and your family well.
Yep, thank you very much. And yourself and everybody listening. As they say, stay safe. Or if we were Vulcans, I think we would say live long and prosper. But there we go. That's.
I can still just about do that. Thanks very much for today, Julian. Much appreciated. And if you're a MEF member or not, wherever you are in the world, please stay safe. And we wish you very well, and see you all again very soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.